and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. A recent incident involving a school in Johor offering an SPM workshop for its poor-performing Malay Muslim students has brought to the fore once again the issue of racism and discrimination in schools and in the wider education system. Now, education is one of the most powerful tools against racism. It's said to be able to shape worldviews, to connect members of communities who might never have met before, and to help us imagine the world we want. But are we using education to fight racism of decades? Architects of Diversity is a non-profit which champions diversity, equity and inclusion in Malaysian classrooms. Joining me on the show today is Jason Wee. He's the co-founder of Architects of Diversity. Jason, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Melissa.
I want to talk a little bit about what AOD, Architects of Diversity, does and what it's seeking to address.
Right, so what AOD does is we're trying to build spaces for a just, peaceful, and sustainable Malaysia. And we do this in particularly an identity lens, right? So we're looking at communities of race, communities of religion, communities of gender, and how do we bring these communities together for greater understanding? We primarily run youth programs, creating spaces that bring youth from different backgrounds to have greater understanding of each other and then becoming champions in their own communities. On today's pertinent topic, we also do an anti-discrimination campaign called Sekolah Semua, specifically for anti-discrimination in education. I think everyone talks about how our education system might be unequal or unjust, but surprisingly, no one's really campaigned for reform within the education specifically. So we were the first ones to take that mantle. Other than that, we also do various sorts of resource building for teachers in particular. So, for example, we have a website that has resources for teachers to access that would provide inclusive work plans and classroom schedules in there for them.
Why do you think no one has attempted to, to do something more concrete about racism in education?
So education is really, really a thorny matter in Malaysia, right? We know that education has been the really fire starter in Malaysian conflict. We look at historically how the Razak education plan was a huge contention at point of independence, and even in the NEP, where education was a centerpiece of affirmative action. And all of that has contributed to a focus on the structure of education and how race contributes to that. So we're talking about quotas, we're talking about what schools Bumi Putra can have access to exclusively. But at the same time, this discussion around education and race has also blurred out what has been happening within our national schools. So we're talking about SKs or SMKs and what's going on within these spaces. I think for many of us who grew up perhaps in the 2000s or 90s, we perhaps can look back to SMKs as a very diverse place. But we know that SMKs and national schools are becoming less diverse, and we need to ask, why are they becoming less diverse? One of the sources of why parents are pulling their students away, especially minority parents, is that they feel that their children might get discriminated within schools, either becoming a victim of racism, becoming a victim of as a religious minority. And there are currently still no guidelines from the Ministry of Education or any form of federal law that protects individuals, specifically children, in schools from being victims from discrimination of sorts.
Okay, we'll come to that. But before there can be guidelines, there first has to be an acknowledgement of the problem. Is there an acknowledgement that discrimination and racism can happen in schools, in classrooms, on school grounds, by people in schools?
I think we have not seen the level of acknowledgement that is important, that is required really to start taking it at its neck. When we look at discrimination, we're not just talking about the one-off incident that gets viral on social media, right? Because I think that's very easy to characterize. Oh, this outrageous incident that
we all have like a knee-jerk reaction to whenever we hear these types of stories, and it also solidifies some deep-held perception that we have. Oh, schools are very racist, or schools are bred in racism is bred in schools.
Exactly, but then you do also hear about these stories. For example, I can't become a class monitor because of my race or gender, and I cannot join this team because there's too many minority group members or members of a particular race. And these things have become so commonplace and normalize that when you ask any Malaysian, they'll just go, yeah, that happens. That happens. And everyone accepts these anecdotes as matter of fact. And because it's so, it's so thick to us like water that we don't even question that it's water. We conducted a survey in 2021 among adult Malaysians, so it was retrospective. And so 50% of Malaysians, adult Malaysians, have experienced some form of discrimination when they were in schools. And that number actually increased for younger Malaysians below 30. So a lot of times, you hear older Malaysians saying, it wasn't as bad in my time. That perhaps has a kernel of truth in it. How have we let our schools get to the point of where students are either discriminating each other or teachers discriminating students? Obviously, discrimination, we can't view it in a vacuum.
Okay.
We need to see it in the sense that it's obviously part and parcel of a larger socio-political conflict that's going on. But with that being said, we have guidelines for bullying. We have guidelines for many other behavioral issues in schools, but we still do not have guidelines for what counts as discrimination. And so when teachers say these things, or trying to convert their student to Islam, or using a slur within classrooms, yes, that's wrong. But partially, no one ever told them they can't do that.
Right. So because no one has actually said this is wrong. Jason, how do we talk to school children about race and racism and discrimination?
So I think when we start a conversation about race and racism, I think everyone in Malaysia feels like a victim, right? I think the affirmative action that we've had has put Malay majority members, especially, feeling like a defensive because Malays have been socioeconomically disadvantaged historically. But at the same time, non-Malays, and particularly Chinese and Indian communities, feel that they've been wrong, and they have not being able to access these institutions. So the conversation on race and racism must center around, one, being able to be honest with one's feelings, and number two, also acknowledge that there is something wrong with the system currently, and let's have some form of fixing or reparations for that. I think we're not at even a position to even question the status quo. I mean, even in classrooms, there's so much sensitivities around talking about race. When we have programs, for example, with secondary schools, children age 16, or even up to university level, every time we bring up the topic about racism, or everyone's really quick to shut it down. Malaysians are really nice in the sense that, no, we all need to be tolerant and non-discriminatory.
Right.
But everyone will say that. But then push comes to shove, somebody makes a joke, a racist joke or a sexist joke, and everyone laughs in silence because we feel that we shouldn't call someone out on that behavior. So it's great that we have the positive side, but we also must deal with the negative side on things, and we need to have that conversation with students.
Very quickly, I just want to ask you, when you have these types of programs, how do you destigmatize? Because we're conditioned to think it's sensitive, don't talk about it, let's sweep it under the rug. How do you destigmatize the conversation to ask or to talk about questions about race?
Right, so the issue with, especially when engaging youth with these conversations, the first thing you need to do is create a safe space, right? And a space that doesn't prescribe them the correct answers. I think a lot of the things that we're even still seeing from the current government is that here's the prescribed model for what Malaysia should look like. Here's how you should behave, right? And any deviation for that could be punished. That's not a safe space. What if someone has a different opinion? So we need to establish the fact first that your opinion is welcome, and you will not be attacked personally for that. And I think we're still a long way for our classrooms for creating spaces for that nationally for youth.
All right, okay, we're going to take a very quick break, but we'll be right back with more on this topic. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. We're talking about how to address racism in schools and in the wider education system. Joining me on the show now is Professor Datuk Dr. Nur Azia Awal. She's the Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, or SUHAKAM, and she looks specifically at children's rights. Professor Azia, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Can I very quickly get a sense from you as to the extent of the problem? What do you understand to be the extent of the problem? How does SUHAKAM view the issue of racism in education?
Well, I think to start it off, I think Sohakam had a couple of issues, some alleged actions in a way that racism was raised. And I think in from 2019 to 2022, one of our thematic areas that we wanted to have a look was racism and xenophobia and all that. And because the issue was raised, and we felt that maybe this is something that we need to look at and seriously find how we could actually handle the situation. Now, the other one is that in terms of school, I mean, it has started like quite some time ago, and we have that. I think it depends on where you go to school and what are the situation. Because I remember very well, I did a research for state of Johor. This was in 2010 maybe, yeah. And that's when I actually could, when we were interviewing the students, it was on profiling students or children with various social issues. But then we found out other things when we were asking them questions, and why, and then we realized that racism is quite at a higher level, without real, and I was like thinking, well, how did it happen? I didn't know, but because when I was at school as a young girl, I do not see this racism issue being brought up or even come into any discussion at school. But when I did that research, I surely, I can assure you that this
Right.
issue came out, yeah, and was talked about by the students.
So why aren't we talking to children about racism? Clearly, they have concerns, they have questions. Who do you think is equipped to talk to children about racism and answer their questions?
Well, I think it is at school that we need to talk about racism. We need to discuss or talk to children about non-discrimination. And when we talk about non-discrimination, we talk about being Malaysians, people always talk about we are very proud that Malaysia is a multiracial society, multi-religious society. And for that matter, we must actually explain our roots, and so that there is no feeling of like, I don't like these ethnic groups or something like that. So these are the things that actually should started not only at school but should start at home. It will really depend on what you talk to your children at home, why you do not allow children to do certain things, do not have non-ethnic group that let's say you're a Malay, you say, oh, don't go and, I don't like you to have friends in these other ethnic groups. That I think is very important. Parents must know what is racism and what is not, and this boils down to a lot of other issues, like sometimes it was talked about, and most of the time it was just like swept under the carpet because people do not want to discuss it, and people do not want to admit that we do have racism issues.
Right. It's long been a sensitive topic, so therefore becomes difficult and ugly to talk about. Professor, can I ask you about the other adults in children's lives, teachers, school administrators? What are their roles when it comes to destigmatizing conversations about race and also understanding what constitutes discrimination?
I think one of the role of Sohakam is to educate the public and also to advise government on various issues of human rights. And I think this is where, because we already have the ATAM syllabus, the best practices in human rights issues, and this was taught at like 300 over schools in Malaysia, and with that, I think it is important that teachers actually impart those knowledge, explain to children what is racism, what is not racism. If you say things like this, it be sensitive, and these are the do's and the don'ts in terms of multiracial society. But I think for a very long time, our history syllabus has been focusing on one ethnic group and actually saying that these are the problems that we have. So sometimes these are the issues that I think we we really need to, and teachers play a very, very important role in actually trying to explain to children, particularly at a very younger age, from standard 1 to standard 6. And then when they move on to Form 1 to Form 5, it's become even more important for them to even understand the Constitution, understand the different race and their rights. And that is, I think, that we should start now before things get worse.
So Prof. Azia, what would you like the new, education minister to, how would you like her to act on this issue? As you said, sooner rather than later.
Yes, to me, it's good opportunity for her to actually start on, this issue, to start on looking at. I do know that they have been appointing various advisor to look at the national curriculum. So you must actually, to me, it's important to have a human right syllabus in that new curriculum, so that everybody knows their rights and actually reducing or even eliminating racism among society.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for speaking with me. That was Professor Datuk Dr. Nur Azia Awal, the Children's Commissioner for Suhakam. We're going to take a very quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. We're back in the studio with my guest, Jason Wee. He's the co-founder of Architects of Diversity. Jason, you heard my conversation with Professor Datuk Dr. Azia Awal a little bit earlier. Maybe you can respond to some things that she said.
I think, well, I just want to point out that I very much agree with Prof. Azia in terms of the human rights component in schools. However, it's great that, students would know about human rights, but then if an individual, a student gets discriminated, what happens after that? Do we have the human rights instruments to appropriately respond to a human rights like abuse or negligence? And so because one in case where we have almost close to no laws governing civil discrimination. So if you discriminate against me, there's currently
recourse, right?
What recourse capacity is that, right? If you call me a slur, there's no recourse capacity for that, even at the civil level. What more in schools? So sometimes, we see individuals voicing out on social media or even going to the police. But the reason why they have to do that is because there's no appropriate channel right now. All complaints to the Ministry of Education goes on one main website, which is called CISPA. But that receives all complaints from a faulty roof all the way to being called a slur. And so how is the ministry able to receive and handle these kinds of cases appropriately? That's not happening right now. And so, yeah.
So when the ministry has not yet acknowledged that there is a problem, there are no clear guidelines or paths for recourse. So what was it that you were hoping that they would do?
Right. So I think it's just to correct that. I think YB Fadlina has mentioned that she wants to tackle this.
Okay.
But just saying that you want to tackle it isn't sufficient. One, it's guidelines. Two, it's proper correction measures. What are the rehabilitation or punitive measures that you put on both teachers and students? To know that teachers cannot just get away with this. And the third thing is clearly making sure that victims come forward. And I think that's why it's such a issue that's been so deep-rooted. Because people feel that they haven't been able to voice out, it goes on and multiplies and gets even deeply more rooted in society.
Do you think that the ways that Malaysia has always dealt with racism is to paint a very rosy picture and to have, to create conversations at a mamak's shop, or are those, or I think sometimes they have like film screenings and feel-good things.
I think we are absolutely dopamine obsessed when it comes to wanting to feel good.
Right.
That we have these continuous campaigns about what Malaysia should be, from Malaysia Prihatin to Keluarga Malaysia to Malaysia Mandiri. Great. Obviously, we need those things, right? Because those positive feelings are important for intergroup understanding. But what happens to prevent the negative aspect? And that's really what's missing and must be addressed by the current government.
Okay. Coming back to schools, Jason, you mentioned a bit earlier that schools are becoming less diverse.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the implications of having a homogeneous classroom and whether making classrooms more diverse is the quote-unquote solution
Right.
to racism.
So first thing I want to say that we actually don't have the data to appropriately say schools are becoming less diverse.
Oh, okay.
So because the desegregated data as per to each school, that isn't released by the ministry. So we actually don't know. So I hope the new government will release that. The second thing is, I think diversity and heterogeneity within the schools is important, but you're not just going to chuck students of different races and backgrounds into one school and call it quits. I've been to schools, I walk in and there's this very much visible line that divides the Malay and Chinese students, and they're speaking completely different languages. They're not talking to each other whatsoever. The school is mixed, but they're not talking.
Okay.
And so just stuffing people in the same school isn't enough, right? What other steps to make sure that within the school, that's one, intergroup mixing, and number two, and this goes back to a larger and more contentious topic of language policy, right? Are students having a mixed enough or capable to talk to each other? Because even though they come from different languages, I think this is really a very fundamental source. If you go to many schools in say KL, where the students are primarily speaking English, you might find that there's more interracial mixing. But that's not necessarily the case when there's a language barrier to that.
Right. Well, one of the things that I thought was quite interesting that Prof. Azia brought up was during the process of her research with Suhakam was that she discovered children had questions or had experiences of discrimination and wanted to talk about it. What do you think are the ways in which the schools, the school administrators, the teachers can contribute to more conversation about discrimination?
Yeah. So again, I think just going back to the picture where it's great to have a prescription about what are the ground rules to be respectful when we speak and so on and so forth. But how are you prescribing that conversation shouldn't happen, right? That means we shouldn't say the conversation should go and everyone should agree on this topic. And I think that's a danger. And so I think when it comes to schools and teachers, AOD is working this a bit, but we need to equip teachers with even just the basic understanding. Even teachers, if students are asking them, and I've spoken to quite a number of teachers, they don't know how to respond. They don't know they're not sure how to respond, what's the most effective way, and they're also in some ways scared to respond.
Yeah.
What if they end up on the news?
Right.
As per if something goes wrong, right? So it really needs a lot of guardrails to be around. There needs to be a lot of guardrails around this conversation as well to ensure that teachers are well equipped to be able to operate safely and not go into areas that it will end up triggering a greater controversy.
Yeah. How do you go about equipping teachers to have such difficult conversations? I mean, some parents aren't even equipped to have them, let alone having, the other adults in the child's life, teachers, to talk about it.
I think this goes in a bigger question. Again, I know it's many questions, right?
Right.
But how do we have classrooms be more discussion-based as well?
Yeah.
Right? Because I think a lot of our education right now is textbook-based, and sure, there are efforts to move away from that to project-based learning, but a lot of it is still referring to a biblical or Bible, not in a religious sense, but it's a main source, and
right.
let's follow that. How do we ensure that the discussion happens in classrooms, but also that we don't examine that, right? There's no one correct answer scheme for that. And so I think teachers need to be able to do this in history classes, in language classes, and even in, if there's pendidikan agama or pendidikan moral, where they're able to say what challenges have you experience when you may be practicing tolerancy. And I think that's really where the potential for growth lies. I'm not sure whether we are equipped there, or I'm not sure the ministry is prepared to go there yet.
That's a good point. Not prepared to go there yet. When is a good time?
Now. I mean, first of all, I think to say you're against discrimination, and we know the ministry is already saying this, what other steps after that? If that's already your stance, this is a great opportunity to show that you have policies behind your rhetoric, right? But I think if the ministry is fearing that there's some form of backlash to that.
Do you think it's going to quote unquote rock the boat?
No, sure, it may rock some boats, but that could perhaps be boats that should be rocked, right? And I think when we're talking about discrimination, we're not only just talking about minority groups. We're talking about schools that don't, say, maybe allow, their, girls to wear baju kurungs or, more clothed options, right? And so how do we navigate those conversations where it's about freedom of choice for the students to make sure that their identity is protected?
Jason, it's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks,
Thank
Melissa.
you for spending time with me. And that's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.